interesting to study ownership to you?
Well, when you think about ownership, I feel like it's fundamental to who we are as humans. And because of that, it touches so many aspects of our lives. And there are really interesting questions and answers in the ownership area. So the more I learn about it, the more questions I have. And to me, that's a very good sign that it's a very rich area to study.
Totally agree. Same thing for me. So out of all of the things you've learned about ownership, based on your own insights, but also maybe based on others, what do you find the most surprising, interesting, perplexing, fundamental?
Oh, I think one of the things I've been fascinated by is this distinction between legal ownership and psychological ownership. And this idea that we can have feelings of ownership for targets that are impossible to be legally owned. So for example, public parks, public lakes, we can feel ownership and responsibility, and we steward those resources, even though we have no legal ownership of those. So I find that interesting. Another area that I find really fascinating is work that you've done on privacy and ownership of our personal information, and how certain personal information we feel more ownership of and other personal information we don't. I feel like you're doing some really great work on that area, and I find it really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's actually one of the most surprising puzzles to me too, how often it's actually not predictive of how people behave. Whereas
Right.
it tends to be a great predictor, but in these contexts,
yeah, it's really, and the norms are so different, right? Like at least in Europe, people have more awareness of digital information. I feel like in the US, we're lagging behind. We're starting to get a little bit further along, but yeah, people just give away everything and all their friends' information. I still remember the talk that you gave, and it's just very impactful.
Yeah, actually, our data show that in the US, people might actually be not less sensitive than in Europe. Was quite surprised by that. There was actually even more awareness in the last studies we did. There was more awareness by the US participants than by European students. So one never ceases to learn.
I bet it's because we're just waking up to it. So it's been more in the news, right? It's just more salient or top of mind, maybe now.
Maybe it's also a good thing that people wake up at a time when there's more that they can do against it.
Right.
Waking up too early numbs you again, right? So it's, yeah.
Right. Too depressing if you can't do anything.
But you know what, that's the perfect kind of like transition to the next question.
Yes.
And that's kind of like, mankind society and societies are facing different issues out there. I mean, environmental issues,
yes,
issues with digitalization and aging population, whatever else. So kind of like, where do you see the role of ownership, property, possession, whichever facet you want to pick on in those issues, or pick out any?
It's pretty much everything. So I was thinking about one example that I've been thinking about lately. It's this idea of cultural appropriation. So people using elements from another culture that is deemed unfair or in a negative light. And really what that speaks to is this legitimacy of ownership. Like, when is a claim of ownership legitimate, and when is it not? When is it flattery, and when is it cultural appropriation? Like, I feel like that's a very timely issue that ownership can help inform. It's one example, right? And then digital privacy, aging population, and disposition of objects, right? I feel like ownership speaks to almost every element of what we're dealing with. So in that sense, there's so many questions that need to be answered.
Right. Totally agree. And that actually already brings me to my last question, the most personal one I'm having. And that's, what's your most valuable possession? And you interpret the term valuable however you wish, right?
Okay. What's interesting about this is my first reaction is thinking about material possessions. And maybe they say research is me search. You study things you're really interested in. But I don't really have any material possessions that I care that much about. It's kind of interesting to think about. But then I thought of what I really value is my memory. And do I share it? maybe too much, depending on who I'm sharing it with. But I feel like that's something that is very valuable, that I share a lot. And, you know, it was a really interesting exercise to think about, what do I really value and would I share it? So thank you for that question. Really interesting.
I was doing a mock interview with myself, and actually I really struggled with that question myself. It's one thing to pose it to others, but it's a whole different thing to be asking oneself.
But I feel like, you know, a lot of stuff. So this is kind of, I know you won't use this, which is great, but I had someone snuck into our house and they took my laptop, my wallet, right? And it was horrible on so many levels. But I had a note in my wallet from my daughter when she was little, and it said, "Tooth Fairy, can I keep my tooth?" So it was like, and that of everything, it's like, okay, you know, this is meaningless to the person who took it, but it's so valuable to me. And then it's like, well, at least I still have the memories, you know, like it's just no one got hurt. Like it wasn't, but it was really interesting to think about somebody violating your personal space and taking something and how that feels. So anyway.
It's actually a good connection to what Russ Belk was also talking about. Because I interviewed him this morning, and he was also talking about actually the home as such an important place, and that he was lucky that nobody kind of like went into his house and broke in and stole and touched his things, and how this might feel like rape.
And I think what's interesting is that same day I had to go get a new driver's license. So I go into to deal with that. I come out and I couldn't remember where I parked my car. And I remember thinking someone stole my car. Like, you don't feel safe. You feel like there's no safe spot. So like, where should I leave my phone? I can't leave it in the car because someone will steal my car. I can't leave it in my house, even with, you know, it's just a really unsettling feeling. And it lasted for me about a week. Other people said I would move out of my house if that happened. I didn't feel like that. But it's like, it makes the boundaries between what you own and what someone else can take very fuzzy. And it's scary. Like you sort of lose your bearing of who you are when you don't feel safe. So
super deep insights. I actually started to do a project on that many years back, and it's one of the things in my file drawer that I have some initial insights on, but that haven't come out yet. But because it is a very fundamental question. I mean, there's been some research back in the 70s that I know of, but mostly from the perspective of kind of like, you know, I mean, you definitely have come across this also because it's also covered in the territorialism research, where kind of like, you know, when there's a territory marked with personal belongings, etc., thieves would have second thoughts of going in there.
Right.
That is kind of like this interplay between you as an owner being able to protect things in where non-evidently protective measures, but by just having flowers on your balcony, right?
No, it's really,
so it might be doing as good a job as having a CCTV camera there. So that's kind of like super interesting also from that perspective. And so we were then kind of like looking a little bit at the victim thing, and there's some research on, you know, kind of like Hurricane Katrina, what happened to people after they lost all their belongings, etc. So that's
interesting.
It's super interesting. And that actually, again, so that seems to be the theme coming up now, because again, Russ also was talking a lot about detachment, or kind of like letting go. So maybe this is where we're progressing now.
Well, you know what's interesting about that, when you were asking about my most valued possession, I was thinking that I'm a person that when I get rid of stuff, I feel better. Right? So it's like a cleansing. But I know other people feel uncomfortable because they're very attached to things. So that individual difference and where that comes from, I think is interesting. And related to that, so this idea of, you know, public goods and you feel stewardship and responsibility, Floyd Rudman said, but it could also go the other way. And I've thought a lot about this, right? So because you own it, you take advantage of it. And I thought of like the ownership of another person. Like that's very depressing research to read, but like spousal abuse, it's like, I own you so I can do whatever I want to you. Right. And what makes people protective and what makes people abusive? And he thinks it's how you're brought up. But it's very like there's some moderator there that we didn't address at all.
Yeah.
But it's super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, that always kind of like also goes to the, so yeah, it's also the question of kind of like when we talk about psych ownership, what level are we talking about? Are we talking about a 7 on a 7-point scale? But what does that mean, right?
Exactly.
I think we are still a little bit simplistic in how we measure it, because we don't have these kind of like malicious and malign and what's that, benign facets of it in there. So yeah.
Well,
yeah,
the other thing,
to do.
well, the other thing about that, so there's a paper that we had where it was on virtual reality and looking at a hand, and you can feel ownership of a hand, right?
Yeah.
So it was body ownership. I feel like that's my body.
Yeah.
The means are very low. Like it might bump from 2 on a 7 scale to 2.5 or 3, but they're still meaningful because it changes willingness to pay. You know, it changes some variables that marketers are interested in, even though the changes are really small. So I've thought about that too. It's like, wow, it's a little change, but it's still meaningful.
Yeah, yeah. And the question is that little change similarly effective if it's on the upper side of the scale?
Right.
That's what I don't know, right? And the question is, do the malicious things, are they throughout the scale?
Yeah.
The scale is meaningful, or is there a certain spectrum where people would actually kind of like use it to basically exploit what they feel that they own?
Right.
I don't know. Or is that scale just too simplistic? That's what that's what
Right.
I've been wondering, not just conceptually, but also empirically for some time. So yeah.
The other related to that is strength of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would talk to Joann Peck about this a little bit, like attitudes, right? There's a strength of attitude, but this idea of some things you feel a lot stronger. So you may still rate it like 5 out of 7, right? Like I feel ownership, but there's also, it's like an attitude towards an object, but some people feel a lot stronger, right? They're more resistant to getting rid of something. And I think about parallel to attitude, it's like attitude change, right? I may not ever want to change. So I feel strong ownership. I feel like strength of ownership is something that would be really interesting.
That's true. And I just, yeah, and it's something where I just wonder to which extent that strengths might not be misleading even sometimes, right? Because if you want to have a strong claim of ownership, so you have a strong desire to have it, but you have still some uncertainty in it, maybe you answer more strongly because your desire is coming into the answer rather than your actual sense of it's already mine. So if it's kind of like, of course it's mine, what a question, maybe people answer less strongly.
That's interesting.
Than if they still have some kind of like desire to make a claim against others.
Yeah, so if it's sort of ambiguous, you might want to go way on the scale to sort of state your claim.
Yeah, exactly, because it has this element in there, right? So it might be.
It's really interesting. I know. See, this is the issue, right? There's so many questions.
It's true.
So I think you've been a leader in this area, and it's really nice to sort of have this spot where you gather people together. I mean, if we didn't have that first ownership conference, I never would have met you or Colleen or like a lot of people, right? So I just can't wait till we have another one.
Yeah, me too.